There is a generation walking through life right now that grew up being told they could be anything. They were handed participation trophies, shown motivational posters on classroom walls, and raised on the belief that hard work plus passion would always equal success. They were called special. They were called the future. They were told that if they just studied hard enough, worked hard enough, believed hard enough, the world would open up for them like a door that had been waiting all along. That generation is the Millennials, and today, that same generation is exhausted in a way that goes far deeper than just being tired. It is a bone-level, soul-level fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to fix. And understanding why requires us to look honestly at what this generation actually lived through, and what that living did to their minds. Millennials are generally defined as those born between 1981 and 1996. They are now in their late 20s to early 40s. They are adults in the full sense of the word. They are raising children, managing careers, paying mortgages or trying to, building businesses, and navigating relationships. They are, by any measure, fully functioning members of society. But beneath the surface of their daily functioning, psychological research is revealing something that many of them have known in their bodies for years. This generation carries a particular kind of stress that is not individual. It is collective, it is generational, and it has been building for decades. The story begins in childhood, because most psychological stories do. Millennials grew up in an era of intense optimization. The parenting culture of the 80s and 90s, particularly in middle-class households, shifted toward what researchers now call intensive parenting. Children were not simply allowed to grow up, they were developed. Their schedules were packed with activities. Their achievements were tracked. Their futures were projected onto college applications before they had finished elementary school. The message underneath all of this, even when it came wrapped in love, was clear. Your value is tied to your performance. Rest is for people who have already earned it. Ambition is not optional. This created a generation that internalized achievement as identity. Psychologists call this contingent self-worth, which means that a person's sense of value depends on external outcomes. When you succeed, you feel worthy. When you fail, you do not just feel disappointed. You feel like you have lost something essential about who you are. For millions of millennials, this became the invisible architecture of their inner lives. They did not just want to succeed, they needed to, because success and self-worth had been quietly fused together before they were old enough to question it. Then came the digital revolution, and it did not arrive gently. The internet, social media, smartphones, and constant connectivity did not just change how millennials communicated, they changed how millennials experienced themselves. Suddenly, comparison was no longer limited to the neighborhood or the school hallway. It became global and constant. You could now see at any moment what everyone else was achieving, building, earning, eating, wearing, and experiencing. And the human brain, which evolved to care deeply about social comparison, because social standing once determined survival, had no natural defense against this. The comparison machine was running 24 hours a day, and millennials grew up inside it during the exact years when their sense of self was still forming. Social media did something else too. It created the performance of a life. The carefully curated photographs, the announcements of milestones, the highlight reels that everyone knew were highlight reels but consumed as though they were reality. This performance required a constant management of image. It required labor that was invisible and never compensated, and it introduced a specific kind of anxiety that researchers have only recently begun to fully name. It is the anxiety of never being enough, because there is always someone else's version of enough glowing on a screen in your hand. Into this psychological landscape arrived two of the most defining economic events in recent history. The first was the financial crisis of 2008, which struck just as the oldest millennials were entering the workforce. They had done everything correctly. They had gone to college, taken on debt to do so, earned their degrees, and showed up ready to begin the lives they had been promised. The economy collapsed beneath their feet. Jobs disappeared. Internships became the new entry-level. Entry-level became the new mid-career. And the debt they had taken on to secure that future sat there, compounding, while the opportunities they needed to pay it off were simply not available in the way they had been told they would be. The second event was the pandemic of 2020. By then, many millennials had finally, after years of grinding, begun to find some footing. They had established careers, started families, built something resembling stability, and then the world shut down. Remote work, isolation, grief, economic disruption, and existential uncertainty arrived simultaneously. And this time, they were not young adults just starting out. They were parents, partners, caregivers, professionals, and they were managing all of those roles while the ground shifted again. The psychological cost of that period is still being calculated, but it was significant, and for a generation already carrying accumulated stress. It was in many cases the moment when something quietly broke. What breaks, when it breaks, tends to show up in the body and the behavior before it ever gets named. Burnout is the word that millennials use most often, and the clinical definition of burnout is worth understanding. It is not just tiredness. It is a state of chronic stress that leads to physical and emotional exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, and a feeling of ineffectiveness. It is the feeling that no matter how much you do, it is never enough, and you are running on empty while the demands keep rising. The World Health Organization formally recognized burnout as an occupational phenomenon in 2019, which was notable timing given what was coming the following year. Millennials report burnout at higher rates than previous generations, and the reasons are layered. They work in an economy where the social contract between employer and employee has been fundamentally rewritten, where their parents might have expected job security, pensions, and linear career paths. Millennials navigate gig work, contract roles, constant pivoting, and the expectation of always-on availability that smartphones made possible and professional culture made mandatory. They are also the first generation to have to figure out retirement savings in a world where traditional pensions largely no longer exist, while also carrying student loan debt that previous generations did not face at the same scale, while also navigating housing markets that have priced homeownership out of reach in many cities, where the jobs actually are. But the exhaustion is not only economic. There is a moral and emotional dimension to it that is harder to measure but just as real. Millennials came of age during a period of growing awareness about inequality, climate change, systemic injustice, and political fragmentation. They were not given the luxury of simply not knowing. Social media, journalism, and the connectivity of the modern world made not knowing almost impossible, and many of them, trained from childhood to care deeply about doing the right thing and making a difference, took that awareness seriously. They tried to stay informed, they tried to act, they tried to vote, donate, protest, educate, and advocate, and the scale of what needs changing, set against the limits of what any individual can do. The world feels like it is on fire, and they are holding a glass of water. The mental health implications of all of this are significant. Rates of anxiety and depression among millennials are higher than among previous generations at the same ages. Rates of loneliness are striking. Despite being the most digitally connected generation in history, many millennials report feeling profoundly disconnected from genuine, meaningful community. This is not a paradox that surprises psychologists. Digital connection and in-person belonging activate different systems in the human brain and body. The first can inform and entertain, and even comfort. The second is what actually regulates the nervous system, reduces cortisol, and produces the felt sense of safety that humans need to function well. In many millennials, through a combination of geographic mobility, busy schedules, housing instability, and the particular social dynamics of adulthood, are operating with a deficit of the second kind. What does this mean? Practically, it means that a significant portion of a generation is trying to perform at a high level in their careers and their parenting and their relationships, while running on a depleted nervous system, carrying unprocessed grief and anxiety, navigating financial pressure, and feeling a vague but persistent sense that they have failed to arrive somewhere they were supposed to reach by now. It means they are, as the phrase goes, doing their best, and their best is considerable, but it comes at a cost that is showing up in therapists' offices, in divorce rates, in decisions not to have children, in the quiet exits from ambitious careers that people call quiet quitting, but which are often better understood as the natural human response to chronic depletion. Understanding this generation is not about excusing them or celebrating them or condemning them. It is about seeing clearly what happened. A group of people was raised with enormous expectations, shaped by technological and economic forces they did not choose, and asked to build stable lives in an increasingly unstable world, all while maintaining the appearance of thriving. The exhaustion they carry is not weakness. It is the accumulated weight of all of that. And the psychological task now, for those willing to undertake it, is learning the difference between the life they were told to want and the life that might actually feel like enough.